My grandfather, Aldrich Thorn, the man who built Thorn Agricultural Dynamics from a bankrupt seed company into a global agritech empire, summoned me to his private conservatory at dawn on the morning of my 21st birthday. The conservatory was his sanctuary, a cathedral of glass and humidity where rare orchids clung to bark and the air tasted of wet earth and blooming things. He sat in his worn leather armchair, a cigar smoldering in the tray beside him, and when I entered, he gestured for me to sit across from him. "Kira," he said, my full name carrying the weight of generations, "the time has come to settle the succession. The Voss family has been our closest ally and our fiercest rival for 40 years. Arthur Voss and I have an agreement. You will marry one of his sons, and the merged empire will have a single leader. Which of the Hunter brothers do you intend to marry?" I'm sorry, I realize I said Hunter earlier, but we must use Voss consistently. I'll correct all names to Voss. He asked which of the Voss brothers. And I didn't hesitate. Theo. Theo Voss. The youngest one. The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear a single petal drop from a cattleya orchid onto the marble floor. My grandfather's cigar stopped halfway to his lips. Beside him, old Mr. Finch, the head gardener, who'd been with the family for 50 years, actually dropped the ceramic pot he was holding and it shattered against the tiles. In the corner, my great-aunt Margot, who never spoke at family councils, made a sound like a kettle coming to boil. Everyone knew what I was supposed to say. Everyone in the room, everyone in the company, everyone in the entire agricultural sector knew that Kira Thorn, the sole heiress to the Thorn fortune, had been hopelessly obsessed with Marcus Voss, the eldest brother, since she was old enough to understand wanting. I had followed him like a shadow through every social season. I had defended his reputation against every whisper of scandal. I had worn the colors he liked and laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and spent years believing that if I just gave enough of myself away, he would eventually love me back. That was in another lifetime. In that lifetime, I married Marcus Voss in a cathedral filled with white roses and 1,000 guests who applauded like we were royalty. 5 months after the wedding, I discovered him in our estate's orchid greenhouse with my cousin Rosalind Thorn, their bodies tangled together among the experimental hybrids my father had bred before his death. Marcus wept and clutched my hands and swore it was a single drunken mistake. I was going to forgive him.
I was already lifting my hand to touch his face when my grandfather burst through the greenhouse door, having heard the commotion from the manor. He took one look at the scene and collapsed with a massive cardiac arrest right there on the damp stone floor. He survived the night, but he never walked unaided again. His voice, which had commanded boardrooms for 4 decades, was reduced to a whisper. Rosalind was sent away to a finishing school in Switzerland. Marcus blamed me for everything. "You could have kept it quiet," he spat at me in the hallway while my grandfather lay in a hospital bed. "You could have handled it privately and protected the family. You chose humiliation." Over the next 4 years, my grandfather slowly faded. My Aunt Elara, who ran our legal division, died in a boating accident that was ruled a tragic mishap, but the investigator's report went missing before it could be reviewed. My father's old business partner, who sat on the board and had always protected my interests, succumbed to an aggressive cancer that moved too fast for treatment. Thorn agricultural patents began appearing in the portfolios of our competitors. Confidential soil remediation algorithms, our drought-resistant crop strains, our proprietary irrigation technology. Everything my father and grandfather had built was bleeding away. And Marcus was always there, in the boardroom with sympathetic eyes and a hand on my shoulder, telling everyone how hard he was working to stop the leaks, while behind the scenes, he was the one opening the floodgates. On the morning I discovered I was carrying his child, I drove to the hospital alone, because Marcus was with Rosalind, who had returned from Switzerland and was staying at a hotel in the city. The mountain road was slick with fog. My brakes failed on a hairpin turn. The last thing I felt was the guardrail giving way and the endless, weightless drop into the valley below. My phone lay on the passenger seat, still showing my unanswered call log. 17 attempts to reach my husband. He never picked up. When I opened my eyes again, I was 20 years old, standing in my grandfather's conservatory with the smell of orchids in my lungs and a second chance burning in my chest.
And I had just named Theo Voss as my chosen husband. "Kira," my grandfather said, slowly setting his cigar aside with great care, "are you quite certain you understand the implications of that choice?" "I understand perfectly." Theo Voss has never attended a board meeting. He's never shown interest in the company. He left the family estate years ago, and as far as I know, he lives in a research hut in the wetlands studying mushrooms. Fungal remediation networks, I corrected him gently, and I know exactly where he lives. You've spoken to him? Not yet. Great Aunt Margot finally found her voice. This is absurd, she declared. The girl has clearly had some kind of breakdown. Kira, dear, you've been chasing Marcus for 5 years. You can't simply change your mind overnight like flipping a switch. I didn't change my mind overnight, I said quietly. I've been thinking about it for a very long time. They couldn't possibly understand how long. The formal council adjourned with nothing resolved, but the news spread faster than blight through a wheat field. By the time I walked out of the conservatory and into the grand salon where the extended families were gathering for my birthday reception, every pair of eyes in the room tracked my movement like a field of surveillance cameras. Marcus Voss was holding court near the grand piano, surrounded by his usual entourage of investment bankers and social climbers. He was tall and golden and dressed in a suit that probably cost more than the annual salary of most of the people in the room. His charisma was a physical force, the kind of magnetism that made people want to be near him even when every instinct told them to run. When he saw me, his expression flickered through surprise and something sharper before settling into his familiar smirk. "Kira," he called, beckoning me with a lazy wave. "There you are. I've been looking for you all afternoon. Come sit with me." In my previous life, I would have crossed the room in seconds and settled at his feet like a loyal dog. This time, I walked to the opposite side of the salon and poured myself a glass of elderflower cordial.
Marcus's smirk faltered. One of his associates, a stock trader named Felix, made a loud comment clearly intended to carry. "Looks like your loyal subject is finally learning some independence, Marcus. Must be a passing phase." Marcus rose from his seat and crossed the room toward me, his stride confident and predatory. "Kira," he said, his voice low and intimate, meant only for me. "What's going on with you? You've been strange all week. If this is about the gala last month where I didn't dance with you enough, you need to understand that I have responsibilities. I can't always be your entertainment." I took a sip of my cordial. "I'm not upset about any gala, Marcus." He frowned. "Then what is it?" "Because I've heard a rumor." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That you told your grandfather some nonsense about marrying Theo? You're not actually serious about that." "I'm completely serious." "You can't be. Theo is a recluse. He's barely even a Voss. He hasn't been to a family event in 6 years. What possible reason could you have for choosing him?" I looked at him directly. Maybe I'm tired of being part of a crowd. He recoiled as if I'd slapped him. His entourage had fallen silent, straining to hear. The entire salon was holding its breath, watching the golden sun get rejected in real time by the woman who'd worshipped him for years. Marcus's face went through several expressions, confusion, and then anger, and then a cold, controlled mask. "Fine," he said, straightening his cuffs. "Whatever game you're playing, Kira, it won't work. I know you. You'll be back at my side within the week." He stalked back to the piano, and his entourage scrambled to follow. I watched him go and felt nothing. My birthday dinner was a formal affair, with 30 guests seated around the long mahogany table in the dining hall. My grandfather sat at the head, looking tired but resolute. My great-aunt Margot sat across from me, radiating disapproval. And my cousin Rosalind Thorn arrived 40 minutes late, wearing a dress that belonged to my mother. I recognized it immediately, because I had memorized every stitch of that dress from old photographs. My mother, Celeste Thorn, had designed it herself, a gown of deep midnight blue silk, with hand-embroidered constellations picked out in silver thread across the bodice. She had worn it to the Thorn Centennial Gala when I was 7 years old, and I had sat on the staircase banister watching her descend like a queen. She had vanished 6 months later. Her car had been found abandoned on a coastal road, and her body had never been recovered. My father had died of a heart attack within a year, leaving me as the sole heir. And now Rosalind was wearing my mother's gown, as if it had been made for her. I set down my fork. Rosalind floated to the empty seat beside Marcus and leaned in to kiss his cheek with theatrical intimacy. "Happy birthday, cousin," she called across the table to me, her voice dripping with false warmth. "I hope you don't mind that I borrowed this old thing from the attic. It was just gathering dust up there, and Sebastian said the color suited me perfectly." Marcus smiled indulgently at her. "It does suit you," he said. I picked up my glass of water and drank slowly until I could trust my voice. "The attic?" I said flatly. "Yes." Rosalind's eyes glittered with malice. "I found it in a trunk with some other old things. Your mother had such interesting taste. Didn't she wear this to some event before she disappeared?" The table went very quiet. My grandfather's hand tightened on his cane. "Rosalind," my great-aunt said sharply, but Rosalind ignored her.
What's wrong, cousin? Rosalind asked, her voice dropping the pretense of sweetness now that she had an audience. Doesn't it make you happy to see your mother's legacy being worn by someone who actually appreciates it? I stood up from the table. Every head turned toward me. Marcus was watching with a curious expression, as if he expected me to scream or cry or make a scene that would confirm I was still the emotional, unstable girl I'd always been. Instead, I walked around the table to where Rosalind was sitting. She looked up at me, her smile sharp as a blade. Yes, cousin. I reached down and unhooked the silver clasp at her shoulder. The gown slithered down her arm before she caught it with a gasp. What are you doing? This dress doesn't belong to you, I said, my voice calm and even. It belongs to my mother's estate, which means it belongs to me. I'm taking it back. You can't do that. Sebastian. Marcus started to rise from his chair. Kira, this is unnecessary. Sit down, Marcus. He sat. Rosalind's face had gone white with fury. You're insane, she hissed, clutching the slipping fabric to her chest. I came here to celebrate your birthday, and you assault me in front of the entire family. If you want to celebrate my birthday, you can start by returning everything you've stolen from this house.
I've stolen nothing. Then where did you get the dress? She stammered for a moment, her eyes darting to Marcus for support. Marcus took her hand and stood up, inserting himself between us. That's enough, Kira, he said, his voice cold and authoritative. You're making a fool of yourself. Rosalind found the dress in storage. If you have an issue with that, you can discuss it privately tomorrow, instead of ruining your own party. I looked at him. In another life, this was the moment I would have backed down, apologized for making a scene, promised to be better. That girl was dead. I turned to the footman standing by the service door. Please, escort Miss Thorn to the guest wing and secure my mother's belongings until I can arrange for their proper cataloging. The footman stepped forward. Marcus's jaw dropped. Rosalind shrieked in protest, and my great-aunt Margot actually clapped a hand over her mouth. But the most important thing happened across the room. My grandfather smiled. Later that night, after the guests had dispersed and the manor had fallen silent, I sat in my mother's private study, surrounded by her books and her journals, and the faint lingering scent of her perfume. The gown was folded on the desk in front of me. I traced the silver constellations with my fingertips and felt the weight of everything I was about to do. A soft knock came at the door. Come in. My grandfather entered, leaning heavily on his cane. He lowered himself into the armchair across from me, and for a long moment, we just sat together in the quiet. I miss her too, he said finally.
I know. Every day. He looked at the gown on the desk and something flickered in his tired eyes. You handled yourself well tonight. Your mother would have been proud. Thank you. Now tell me the truth, Kira. Why Theo Voss? I drew a deep breath and began to explain. Theo Voss was the youngest of 5 brothers and the only one who had walked away from the family fortune. When he was 12, his mother, Elena Voss, died under circumstances the family officially described as a sudden illness. Theo had never believed the official story. He had spent his teenage years digging into his mother's medical records, his father's business associates, and the timing of certain patent filings that coincided with her death. At 17, he confronted his father with his findings and was told to never speak of it again. He packed a bag that same night and moved into a boarding school on the other side of the country. After university, he joined an environmental research institute and built a field station in the marshlands 3 hours from the Voss estate. He studied fungal networks and soil remediation, and he published papers in journals nobody read. And he had spent the last 8 years compiling evidence that his mother had been murdered by someone inside his own family. How do you know all this? My grandfather asked quietly. Because I've been reading his research for the past 6 months, and because I believe the same person who killed his mother killed mine. My grandfather's face went gray. Celeste. Dad's accident wasn't an accident, I said, my voice cracking on the words. The brake lines on his car were cut. The police report was buried, but Theo found it through a contact in the Federal Transportation Authority. And Mom's disappearance wasn't random. She had discovered evidence of corporate espionage. Someone was leaking our research to a rival company. She was on her way to meet with a journalist when her car vanished. And you believe this is connected to the Voss family? I believe it's connected to Marcus. My grandfather closed his eyes.
His hands trembled on the head of his cane. When he opened his eyes again, they were clear and hard as flint. "What do you need?" "I need you to invite Theo Voss to the estate for a private meeting. And I need you to trust me." The next morning, I drove out to the wetlands. Theo Voss's field station was a cluster of low, prefabricated buildings set on stilts above the marsh. Solar panels lined the roof, and a network of monitoring equipment hummed quietly in the mist. The road leading to it was unpaved and treacherous, winding through cattails and saltgrass until the asphalt gave way completely. I parked my car beside a battered pickup truck and stepped out into the cool, damp air. He was kneeling beside a test bed when I found him, hands buried in dark, peaty soil. He didn't look up. He was tall and lean, with the kind of physical economy that came from years of working alone. His hair was dark and tied back, and his eyes, when he finally raised them to meet mine, were the color of the marsh itself, gray-green and unreadable. "Kira Thorn," he said. "Theo Voss? You drove 2 hours through the wetlands to find me?" "I did." "Why?" I knelt down beside him, not caring about the mud soaking into my trousers. "Because I know what happened to your mother. And I know you've been trying to prove it." His hands stilled. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he set down his trowel and turned to face me fully. "What do you know?" I told him everything. The corporate espionage, the leaked patents, the brake lines on my father's car, the disappearance of my mother. I told him about the evidence he had uncovered, that I had found through my family's private investigation.
"Come inside," he said. "I'll put on some coffee and you can show me everything." We worked together in the back room of his station for hours that first day and for many days after. Theo had a mind like a locksmith, patient, methodical, and utterly incapable of letting a puzzle go unsolved. He had bank records and shell company registrations and access logs from the Voss family servers that he'd been collecting for years. What he didn't have was access to the Thorn internal network. I gave him that. We discovered that the same shell company that had received leaked Thorn patents had also received payments from an account registered to one of Marcus's personal assistants. We found login timestamps from Rosalind's laptop, accessing restricted Thorn databases at hours when she was supposed to be at university. We found a trail of communications between Marcus and the rival company's CEO, encrypted messages that Theo decrypted using a program he'd written himself. And we found a suppressed autopsy report on Elena Voss that showed traces of a rare compound, a neurotoxin derived from a plant that grew on the Voss estate and was accessible through the family's private greenhouse. Marcus had access to that greenhouse. He had used it to breed rare orchids. By the time we had assembled the full picture, 4 weeks had passed. Theo and I had spent countless hours together in that cramped back room, surrounded by soil samples and coffee cups and stacks of printed records. I learned that he talked to his fungal cultures while he worked, that he had a dry, quiet sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly, and that he missed his mother with a grief so deep it had shaped the entire course of his life. He learned that I was terrified of trusting anyone again, but that I was doing it anyway, because the alternative was letting my family's legacy die. One evening, as the sun was setting over the marsh, Theo looked up from his laptop and said, "We have enough." I knew what he meant.
We had enough evidence to bring to the authorities, enough to open a formal investigation, enough to expose Marcus and Rosalind and the entire rotten network of corruption. But we also both knew that evidence alone wasn't enough. Marcus had lawyers and allies and a golden reputation that made people want to believe him. If we took this to the authorities quietly, it would get buried. We needed a public stage. "The Thorn Agricultural Centennial Gala is in 8 weeks, I said. Theo nodded. That's the stage. We spent the next 8 weeks preparing. Theo reached out to contacts in federal law enforcement, people who owed him favors from his years of consulting work. I worked on my grandfather, slowly bringing him into the full scope of the conspiracy, watching his grief transform into cold, implacable resolve. We planted tripwire files in the Thorn servers to track any further access attempts. We fed Rosalind false information about a new soil remediation patent to see if it appeared in competitor portfolios. It did, within 10 days. The night before the gala, Theo drove to the estate, and we walked together through the orchid greenhouse where my father had once worked. "I'm nervous," I admitted. "So am I," he said. "You don't look nervous." "That's because I've spent 8 years imagining this moment." We stopped in front of a particular orchid, a hybrid, my father had created and named after my mother. Its petals were the color of midnight blue with silver veining that caught the light. "I brought my mother here when I was 7, I said. "She showed me this orchid and told me it was a symbol of resilience,
a plant that could survive in almost any conditions, as long as it had the right partner. Theo reached out and touched the petal gently. She was right. He turned to face me. Kiera, I know we started this as a business arrangement, but somewhere in the last few weeks, I stopped thinking about it as an arrangement. I looked at him. What do you think about it as? He was quiet for a moment. A future, he said finally. Something I haven't let myself imagine for a very long time. I took his hand. Then let's get through tomorrow, and after that we can figure out what the future looks like together. The Thorn Agricultural Centennial was held in the Grand Exhibition Hall at the company's headquarters. The building was a cathedral of glass and steel filled with chandeliers and champagne towers and 1,000 guests who represented every major player in the agritech sector. My grandfather had insisted on attending, despite his failing health, and he stood at the entrance, greeting guests with a warmth I hadn't seen in years. I wore a gown of storm gray silk with a hidden pocket that held an encrypted drive containing every piece of evidence we had gathered. Theo arrived separately, wearing a dark suit that looked more like tactical gear than formal wear. He nodded to me once from across the room, and we began. Marcus was in his element, working the room with his golden charisma, surrounded by admirers and investors who hung on his every word. Rosalind was on his arm, wearing a diamond necklace that I immediately recognized as a piece from my mother's private collection. I walked toward them, and Marcus spotted me. Isla, he called, gesturing broadly. You've been so elusive lately. I was beginning to think you'd abandoned society entirely. I've been busy. So I've heard, he said, his smile sharpening. What exactly have you been busy with? Preserving my family's legacy. Before he could respond, the lights flickered, signaling the start of the formal program. The evening unfolded according to the schedule. Speeches and toasts and a video presentation about the history of Thorn Agricultural. My grandfather gave a short address, his voice trembling slightly, but his words clear and proud. And then it was time. The screen behind the podium flickered again. The audience expected a tribute reel. What appeared instead was a series of financial documents. Bank statements showing wire transfers from a Voss subsidiary to the competitor that had been acquiring our patents. Login timestamps from Marcus's personal devices accessing restricted Thorn research archives. Emails between Marcus and Rosalind discussing the timeline for my father's accident. And the suppressed autopsy report on Elena Voss showing the neurotoxin that had killed her. The room went completely silent. Marcus was on his feet, his face white as bone. This is a fabrication, he shouted, his voice cracking through the silence. Someone has fabricated evidence and hacked the presentation. Shut it down immediately.
But the presentation continued, because Theo was controlling it from the tech booth using a remote console that was physically isolated from the main system. The final image appeared on the screen. It was a photograph of Marcus and my father on the day before my father died. They were standing beside my father's car. Marcus was handing him a bottle of wine. The same wine that had been found spilled in the passenger seat. The same wine that had tested positive for the sedative compound that had caused my father to lose control of his vehicle. Grandfather, I said quietly, I think you should tell security to seal the exits. My grandfather raised his cane and brought it down against the marble floor with a crack that silenced the murmuring crowd. Security, he said, seal every door. No one leaves until the authorities arrive. Marcus bolted for the east exit. He didn't make it. Theo stepped out of the tech booth and intercepted him in the center of the hall. They faced each other, the golden sun and the ghost. Hello, Marcus, Theo said, his voice carrying across the silent room. I believe you killed my mother. I believe you killed her father. And I believe this building is surrounded by federal agents who have been waiting for this evidence for 3 years. Marcus looked at Theo and then at me. His expression cracked open, and what I saw underneath was not rage or defiance, but pure animal terror. You, he whispered, you did this to me. I walked across the silent hall and stopped in front of him. You killed my father, I said. You killed your own mother. You stole my family's life work and sold it to the highest bidder. And you would have killed me too if I had stayed in your orbit long enough. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Marcus. You just never thought there would be consequences. The federal agents entered to every...
3 weeks later, the federal prosecutor announced a sweeping indictment. Marcus Voss was charged with corporate espionage, wire fraud, and 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of my father and Elena Voss. Rosalind was charged as a co-conspirator and faced decades in prison. The rival company's CEO was arrested the same day in a coordinated operation across 3 time zones. On the morning the news broke, I stood on the terrace of my grandfather's estate, watching the sun rise over the agricultural fields that stretched to the horizon. Theo found me there. "It's over," he said. "It's over." He stood beside me, and we watched the light spread across the land. "What happens now?" I turned to him. "Now I think we have a wedding to plan." We were married 6 months later at the field station in the wetlands. The ceremony was small and simple. My grandfather, Theo's research assistants, a handful of friends from the soil science community. There were no photographers, no journalists, no society columnists. There was just the wind moving through the marsh grass, and the man standing across from me with mud on his boots and his mother's ring in his hand. My grandfather gave a speech, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. He talked about my parents, about their love and their vision, and the legacy they had built. He talked about the danger of trusting the wrong people and the courage it took to trust the right ones.
And then he raised his glass and said, "To Kira and Theo, may your partnership outlast every storm." 4 years passed. I stood in the main greenhouse of our new research campus, watching my daughter chase a butterfly between rows of experimental saplings. She was 3 years old, with her father's gray-green eyes and my dark hair and a laugh that could fill any room she entered. Theo came up behind me, carrying 2 cups of tea and a tablet with the latest soil analysis from the Wetland Restoration Project. The morning news had reported that Marcus Voss's final appeal had been denied. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. I set the tablet aside and leaned into my husband's shoulder. "Do you ever think about the other version of things?" I asked. He looked at me. "The version where you didn't drive out to the wetlands. The version where I said no." "Sometimes," he said. "But then I look at you, and I think the universe doesn't make mistakes." I closed my eyes and thought about the girl I'd been in another lifetime. The one who chased a golden man who never loved her. The one who died alone on a mountain road with a phone that never rang. That girl was gone. She had burned away in the fire of a second chance. And the woman who stood in her place was whole and loved and free. The butterfly landed on our daughter's outstretched hand, and she shouted with joy. Theo's arm tightened around my waist. The past was ash. The future was ours.